Well, I think we might get everyone up here and kick things off. I presume, not out of requiring the largest chair, but I'm going to take the middle chair because I'm the chair, right? That's what it means. So why don't you come up? I'm going to quickly introduce the topic that we're talking about, democratizing knowledge. No biggie, obviously. Let's arrange our guys on stage first. Do you want to come up? And I will just quickly introduce each of those, and then I'll introduce the topic. Madani Yunus is appointed Southbank's creative director in September 2018. Prior to this, he took over as artistic director of the Bush Theatre in 2012. In 2013, he won the Groucho Club Maverick Award for theatre, following the most successful season in the theatre's history, which played to 99% capacity. So in terms of making meaningful things popular, he's your man. Luke Harding is an award-winning foreign correspondent with The Guardian. He's reported from Delhi, Berlin, Moscow, and has also covered wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Between 2007 and 2011, he was The Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. The Kremlin expelled him from the country in the first case of its kind since the Cold War. He is literally the man who knew too much. He's the author of Mafia State and co-author of WikiLeaks Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy, The Liar, The Fall of Jonathan Aitken, and the Snowden Files. There's a huge list of things here. Interestingly, Luke's book, A Very Expensive Poison, is an expose of the events behind the notorious death of ex-FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko, which has been adapted for the stage at the Old Vic, and that's happening this August. When I say August. Professor Sunetra Gupta is an acclaimed novelist, essayist, and scientist. We'll be trying to work out how her mind works across those three disciplines in the next 45 minutes. In October 2012, her fifth novel, So Good in Black, was longlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. In 2009, she was named as the winner of the Royal Society Rosalind Franklin Award for her scientific achievements, and Sunetra is Professor of Theoretical Epidemiology at Oxford University's Department of Zoology. She's also interested in the public understanding of science and getting girls into science and many things. I'm keeping these kind of as short as I can, but you get a sense of the august nature of our panellists today. Sandra Shakespeare, finally, works with organisations to wake up the power of difference. Sandra has co-produced programmes with artists as diverse audiences across East London, Essex, and nationally with the National Archives. International work includes coaching artists from the Asiko International Art School across Mozambique, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And interestingly for us specifically, Sandra is co-founder of Museum Detox, which is a collective network of more than 200 BAME workers from museums and wider cultural and heritage institutions across the UK. And one of the things we want to talk about is sort of knowledge as a stick to beat people with. Sandra, I'm going to start with you. So democratising knowledge is what we're going to try to be tackling. And we're talking about, we're in the British Library, we're in the Knowledge Quarter, the much advertised Knowledge Quarter. And we talk, we think about the printing press, we talk about the King James Bible, we talk about education for all, we're in the British Library. We also think of ivory towers and sort of pillars around knowledge and gatekeepers around knowledge. Sandra, I want to come to you first. Is knowledge, and we just looked at Maggie talking brilliantly about her journey. Sadly, not to the moon. One day, Maggie. Is knowledge still for the privileged, Sandra? If we don't start asking big questions.
No, I know. Is it still for the privileged? I think it's an interesting question we're posing here around this idea around can knowledge ever be democratised? I still think we live in a very elitist society in a sense. I still think we're very much bound up by systems of around class structures, which in turn are very much racialised since then. I think there's a big issue around how we access knowledge which Keir very, talked about in his opening as well, and certainly was alluded to in the previous talk before. So I think there are still issues, there are still challenges out there. I still think so much of our future is very much bound up into the class systems you're born into. I grew up around East End. My mother came over my parents came over in the 50s. My father was a welder. My mother was seamstress. You know, I grew up in a very working class area called Hackney Wick, which wasn't that much going on back then. It's very different to what it is now. And so you can kind of sense where, you'll go in terms of your life, your choices, the decisions you make, the careers you make. It was interesting before, was saying about, he'd never heard of a lawyer, at the age of 7 or 8. Well, why would you? And when you are brought up into a working class area, your parents are doing manual jobs. You don't have that. You don't know anybody who's gone to university or been educated. And very much, so much depends on those choices you make. In your teens, in your 20s, so much depends on the access to knowledge you have in schools, whether or not it comes again through things like community centres. Somebody posed the question around outreach and working with young people. It's so important. And it's so important that people here who have positions of power, authority and control actually do something and make sure and try to find ways, however creative it needs to be, to reach those young people who have very, very low aspirations.
And you work specifically with, or a co-founder of Museum Detox. Yeah. That's two words, an august word. I mean, we talked about whether we were going to call them ivory pillars or ivory towers or pillars, and we said maybe we call them pillars. But that sounds like an exact solution to a perceived problem. This idea of how do you get people into museums? Is there something about the way they look, the way the exhibits are arranged? Tell us about a bit more specifically, actually, about how you detox museums and what that means. I think I know, and I think people probably have an idea, but let's ask her.
Well, all right. Well, I think let's go back to way back, and I have absolute credit to Sarah Rajid, who's now head of engagement. I think she's head of engagement now at Museum of London, because Sarah back in 2014 got in touch with me and a few others and says, I've got an idea, I really feel like we need to get a group of us together. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I'm just really fed up of being one of a few. And we kind of came up with this expression around the poppy seed in the rice bowl. You go to conferences, you go to talks, and you are the ethnic minority person, usually on there, and very much always the emphasis is on you to talk around the lack of diversity, the lack of inclusion, the inequality.
I've just done it.
Well, there we go. That's but that's the reality. That's the times that we live. You then by default, because of more ways the colour of your skin, you're deemed to be able to be the ones to talk about these issues. And to fair point, we can say, yes, we can talk from lived experience. So Museum Detox came out of that need that actually we didn't just want to be a group of people who sat in a corner whinging and, oh my gosh, isn't it unfair? Yes, we know the challenges, the lack of opportunities, as I said, the lack of sometimes choices, that if you are born into very much, working class backgrounds, they are limited. It's not to say you don't have them. Sometimes you just have to try 50 times harder than some of your other counterparts. So Museum Detox came out of that culture, very much a DIY culture, in a sense. Well, we need to think about ways of how we can do this for ourselves. We need to think about ways of how people like us, so at the time I worked for the National Archives. I was only going to stay there for 9 months, ended up being about 5.5 years, love them.
But always know your exits.
But there, yeah, and there, I never thought I'd end up somewhere like there. Here I was working for, a government archives, and a whole heap of contention around, as you know, some of the records and the whole 30-year rule and what's released and what isn't released and what do people get access to and what do people don't get access to. At the back of my mind, I'm going off on a tangent slightly. I've just got the programme. I don't know if you saw the programme a couple nights ago, David Olusoga, the Windrush Files. And again, just what's coming out of that and what happens when we release and when knowledge is accessed. And yes, sometimes it takes the historians to be able to go in and interpret that. But there is a big question that says, actually, There's no point hiding this stuff. There's no point museums hiding collections because they think it's difficult, you know, and all this idea around all histories are difficult, right? All histories are challenging. So again, there's a question about making that accessible. So back to the question, Museum Detox, I suppose, came out of a need for, number one, it was around people who identify as being Black, Asian and minority ethnic to come together to think about, actually, we need to start, there's a thing around democratizing knowledge, and I go back to a sort of, I suppose, you need to start with your mindset. You need to start with actually democratizing or decolonizing your mindset. You need to feel empowered in yourself, regardless of the background you're from, that actually I have an opinion, I have something to say. I may not necessarily be the expert or the one that's had the privilege of being educated at certain institutions, but I have something to say, and that's through lived experience. So Museum Detox has now grown from what started off as a handful of us in a pub, round a few pints and a packet of peanuts and crisps on the table, to now over 200 members from, literally, I would say we've got people now from every museum, gallery and library and now archives around the country. And we have friends from around the world who have come to us, who ask our opinions. I like to think we have critical friends, allies, partners. It's very much a conversation. A Museum Detox has always been at the very heart. It's around a conversation to say, actually, how can we come up with solutions and things that work? How can we inspire the generation that probably wouldn't have thought two hoots about being a curator, or, you know, working in collections, or working in conservation, or, you know, working in exhibitions, or seeing themselves in an artistic role, or being a director or whatnot? How can we inspire those group that have very little to actually see and to understand that these are our collections. We are part of a shared heritage, and that these are for, you know, these collections, the stuff in museum is for all of us to show, and it's for all of us to learn from.
Thanks, Sandra. If this were question time now, I would think about how it looked from the audience, and I would go to Sunetra or Luke. But I want to actually ask my next question to Madani. As creative director of the South Bank Centre, is it second nature for you to be, let's use Sandra's word, in detoxing the programme, or thinking broadly and diversely, or is it second nature to you? I expect at organisations like that it hasn't always been the case. Is it second nature? Are there conversations around it at the planning stage? I mean, looking at your roll call of things that are on now, there's a thing called Kiss My Genders, which you've got a great poster to it, which I've seen, which is a wonderful show. These are very diverse things. Does it come naturally to you, or does it require a conversation at kind of board level at the South Bank Centre?
Sure, great question. I've been in post 5 months, so I'm still working it out in answer to this specific
question. Doesn't
know. But I suppose instinctive to me is the idea of context is everything. I think culture has for so long existed in a kind of very privileged vacuum. That culture is that thing that happens over there. And I'm a real believer in the idea that how do we democratize culture? How do we lose control and kind of reinforce our democratic values? We live in a moment in which no single kind of version of what our country is and who it belongs to has included everyone. And that's a kind of the disruptive moment we're in. There isn't a single narrative that includes everyone, let alone everyone in this room. I think we're hampered both in terms of our sharing of knowledge and within culture by the ideas of by an idea I call kind of a new paternalism, which I think is kind of wreaking havoc across our country. This new paternalism is an acceptance that, hey, this stuff we're talking about here, super important. We should all get on it. And so institutions that have historically not really given a shit are now saying, hey, we're going to start caring. Not only are we going to start caring, we're going to implement some of these things. And so on the one hand, you go, oh, that's really great. Finally, you're listening. We're talking about class, we're talking about gender, etc. But on the flip side of that, and this is my idea of the new paternalism, is not only are these ideas being co-opted, the pace of change is being dictated by those institutions. What that change looks like is being dictated by the institutions. And more significantly for me, by co-opting these concerns, the centre ground doesn't change. So we live in a moment where institutions are more interested in looking at the symptoms and not the cause. Because if we were to look at the cause, we'd be asking a much more profound structural question. And so to a disruptive idea, look, I have been a leader of cultural organisations for a number of years now, and this moment really excites me, because I think this is a moment where we can reaffirm kind of who we are, what we stand for, and ideas that I think have felt quite peripheral. How do we bring these ideas back to the centre? Just to take London as an example, because this is a really live point. Like, I don't sit in my office at the South Bank Centre or anywhere else I've worked and kind of come up with these ideas that I think would be lovely and nice to do kind of as an abstract idea. Like, I'm very much driven by what is happening on the streets around us. But just to a couple of quick provocations are 57% of young people living in London today under the age of 18 are black and minority ethnic. 56% today in London. We as a sector have somehow insulated ourselves to the idea that this change, this shift that's going to occur is happening somewhere in the future. It's here. It is today. The choices we make in this room today will determine whether or not, to another generation, the idea of knowledge, the idea of culture, is something that will belong to all, or will it continue to be a kind of privileged space or privileged enclaves that a very few get to access? So here's my disruptive idea. And look, it's a provocation, to be honest, because it's really flawed. But the idea goes, so if we just think for a moment, 56% young people, et cetera, 40% of the working population in our city is BAME. The cultural workforce in our city, 11% are BAME. So here's my disruptive idea. Can we imagine a version of the world in which we link public funding to demographics? Like, what happens in that version of the world? If for a moment we imagine, because here's my guess, this room might look a bit different if we did that. And secondly, what changes? Who suddenly gets included in a conversation that historically they have not been included in? So that's a disruptive idea. Like, how do we change the way in which funding is accessed, privilege is granted? Notwithstanding the fact, if those giving the money started looking a little less like the people receiving it, maybe that might also change the optics around this situation. And I just think I love this moment. I'm just going to wrap this up by saying I love being amongst such great speakers and being in this room, because right now I feel it's that precipice. We're at that moment. It's a now or never moment where we ask these big questions, not knowing quite what the answers are, but knowing those questions ought to be asked. And in order to do that, we have to be prepared in ourselves to sacrifice that thing that we took as being a given, that thing we thought was immovable, that thing we thought was an absolute definite in our lives. If we're willing to sacrifice some of that, I think we arrive at a position where we include more people into a conversation. Yeah, that was it, man. Cool.
I think we've had about 4 people on this stage that could be Prime Ministers. Thank you, Madani. I should say, actually, that we're going to speak for another about 20, 25 minutes amongst the 5 of us on stage, and then there's going to be some questions. So as Keir did, I'll shout out. So just bear some in mind while we're talking. Forgot to say that at the beginning. Whoops. Sorry, Rowley. Sunetra, I wanted to ask you, I know you've been asked before about which hat you wear, which side of your brain you're thinking on as a professor of epidemiology. Did you say it?
Epidemiology, a terrible name.
And as a novelist. But I wanted to ask you a bit more of a sort of philosophical question about the idea of knowledge, as we're talking about democratizing it. Does it run like water? Does it have its own path? Is it something like that? Or do we as people push it where we want it to go? Do we keep it in big reservoirs and only certain people are allowed to turn on the tap? How does it feel to you?
Okay. Right, knowledge. What is knowledge? I guess we could spend a long time talking about what is knowledge. And I suppose you could look at it in both ways. I mean, there is the sense that there is knowledge out there. The word knowledge itself is kind of a bit static, isn't it? You have this sense that there is knowledge out there and we can access it. And all we're doing is trying to find ways of accessing it. But one of the big kind of eureka moments, I think, of the 20th century was realizing that the only way you can access knowledge is by building models of that knowledge, and the model itself, and by model I mean something as simple as the act of seeing, will condition how we receive that knowledge. And I think that was a liberating moment, because suddenly knowledge no longer becomes this monolithic thing that's out there that we just, somehow aspire to and somehow are trying to find the right way to receive. And that in itself is a democratizing moment, because you suddenly realize that we all have different ways of receiving knowledge, and that is the only way to receive knowledge, that there isn't something out there that is privileged and pure. It's our dynamic interaction with knowledge that is knowledge itself. And
you specifically have worked with trying to get girls into science. We talked about this. Maggie mentioned this as well, and that idea that pushing people towards that reservoir, as it were. How have you done that? What have you been your tactics and techniques?
So the next thing I was going to say is that this whole business of how you interact with knowledge applies across the sciences and the arts, which is why I have never distinguished within myself between my desire to do science and to write. They really stem from the same sort of urge. And I think that also fundamentally underlies this business of getting girls into science, or breaking down those barriers. As soon as you create a barrier between the arts and the sciences, you've made two separate boxes into which you can conveniently put, okay, girls in there, boys in there. And so I think one of the fundamental things that needs to be addressed here is this division between the arts and the sciences. I mean, in terms of just getting at the sort of mechanistic process of getting girls into science, I mean, there's so many people doing amazing things like Maggie. I think I'm a very small contributor in that whole explosion of effort, which has just been so wonderful. But I think as a sort of philosophical position, I think there are two things. One is, as I said, this business of splitting the arts and the sciences in that way, just creating these divisions just gives you the opportunity to put people in different boxes. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about, just because it came up and I think is a running theme, is a poverty of aspiration. So that, again, needs to be addressed at a very fundamental level. And the question is, where does that really locate? And I was a little bit struck. I mean, I thought Keir Starmer's talk was amazing, but when he said, oh, these families with 3 kids living in a 2-bedroom flat, and I was thinking in Calcutta, where I grew up, that was almost a luxury to be living in a 2-bedroom flat. And yet there was no poverty of aspiration. It didn't matter that you had to do your homework with all your other siblings chattering around you. So I think we have to think about where the poverty of aspiration really locates. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be throwing a lot of money at moving people out of small flats into somewhere where they do have, I mean, there is a relationship between space and the ability to think. But I think where we need to be putting a lot of money is in exposing people to culture. And I listened to one of the most moving things I've listened to recently is John Bird, founder of The Big Issue, talking about how in his youth, which was spent sort of in and out of juvie, being taken to a concert and just being transformed. These things are transformational, and if there's one thing we owe our youth, it's to expose them to the beauty of science, the beauty of the arts, and to tell them also to destroy the disjunction between privilege and accessibility. Not everything has to be accessible, as in dumbed down, in order to... not everything that's inaccessible is privileged. That's actually a quote from Howard Barker. I think accessibility is something that can be achieved without reducing the beauty and complexity of both the sciences and the arts. And I think someone like Maggie does that so profoundly Well, I think that's what we need to be doing.
So language, I mean, this is a point for all of us on stage as well. I suppose language is one of the gatekeepers of knowledge. It keeps some people out, and it's the language of science, especially perhaps, is necessarily is a very specific language with specific terms. Is that something that people often cite as something that turns them off from, or feels that is a barrier to jumping into science, the language of it?
The problem is that, yes, it is a barrier, but barriers can be surmounted.
Yeah.
That's what we need to say. It's not, we don't need to bring the barrier down.
You need to give
It's
people
a
a ladder.
very exciting thing to jump over a barrier.
Yeah.
That's what we just heard. So that's what we need to tell people, not to say, okay, we're going to chip away at this barrier and make it really, really low. It's to say you can jump that barrier. You really, really can.
Luke, we're moving quite quickly here from the idea of ideas of democratizing knowledge. You've written, as we said when I read your introduction to our audience here, you've written about perhaps what happens when democratizing knowledge goes wrong, or when information and knowledge are used for unfriendly purposes. So has the democratizing of the knowledge gone wrong?
Yeah, well,
Not wholly, but certainly in certain very important international instances.
For sure. I mean, my perspective, I guess, is international, and there's definitely a trend of knowledge under attack, or the idea of knowledge being under attack. Mm-hmm. And that was something that was apparent to me when I was in Russia, reporting for The Guardian, at a time when sort of Vladimir Putin was taking the dimmer switch and making things darker and darker. And what's interesting, I mean, I was there a while ago now, but as a kind of new correspondent coming in and thinking that Russia was a semi-democracy, discovering that it was a sort of postmodern authoritarian regime, and also sort of seeing, in a way, the way in which the sort of Kremlin was taking traditional propaganda techniques, which were there throughout the 20th century in the Soviet period. And
great posters. Not necessarily that much good behind them.
Well, right, but updating them for the age of social media, for Twitter and so on. And what's interesting is that when I was there, sort of the sort of Russian government was road testing things that it later took on tour internationally. So social media trolls. I would write stuff. I would get kind of trolled back then in quite bad English, Sergei from Kaliningrad, and now I get trolled in impeccable English from Brenda from UKIP, who probably isn't Brenda but is actually sitting in St. Petersburg, and all of this has been kind of refined. And the same with Russia Today, which used to be quite clunky, is a kind of Russian propaganda channel, now quite shiny. And they started off with the idea of kind of spreading good news about Russia to the world, and then they realized this wasn't working, and so what they did instead was to actually focus in on Western hypocrisy. Obviously, there's quite a lot of that, but for sort of sovereign purposes, and to convince people that to sort of fuel unhappiness and disagreement. And I think what we've seen in the last few years has been really dismaying. We've seen an attempt by Russia, for example, to influence the US election of 2016 and help elect Donald Trump. And we've also seen a sort of spillover of these techniques, which are really to promulgate information chaos, if you like, and to deny knowledge or kind of empiricism. We've seen it spill over into Western politics. So we've had the rise of Trump, we've had the fact that he kind of lies all the time and it doesn't seem to matter. And I don't want to be too kind of polemical, but it does feel like here in the UK we're also having our own Trumpian moment where, I mean, I was just looking at The Guardian yesterday to see this photo of Boris Johnson in love in the Evening Standard with his charming girlfriend after the row that we reported out on Friday. And then he's kind of incapable of saying when the photo was taken, and it looks like actually it's fake news, and it was taken some weeks ago because his hair is wrong round the back. And this isn't supposed to be an attack.
His hair's wrong round the front.
Well, his hair is.
I don't know. Sorry, I should be editorialising.
His hair is all round wrong. But it's the idea that it's a sort of Kremlin postmodern idea that you can just lie about things and it doesn't matter. And I think my big point is that I feel that knowledge is under assault in a way that I haven't seen as a professional journalist during my career. I think the idea is a cynical one, and it's just to say there is no truth. There are multiple competing narratives, whether it's about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, which I've written a book about, where the Russians say it was MI6, it was Tony Blair, it was Boris Berezovsky, or the shooting down of MH17, which was another big story this week, to the point where people are just confused, and you can take advantage of that confusion to your own benefit. So I think it's a precarious moment, and I really think that what we need is we need Maggie, actually. We need more Maggies. But we need good education. We need people to, kids to be taught, for example, the difference between fake news and real news, to think about sourcing, to think about where knowledge comes from. We need newspapers, we need good sources of information. We need your money. Give your money to The Guardian.
Bob Geldof.
If you don't like The Guardian, give your money to some other news institution. But we need to realize also that we've got to pay in this sort of post-truth moment. We have to pay for proper information and try and support that and have good conversations.
And we joked about the kind of which of Boris Johnson's haircuts, the back or the front, is most ridiculous.
Yeah.
And we're editorialising there. That's something you have to do. I have to do it. We all have to do it. Does therein lie a problem? And we were talking about democratising knowledge. The people that are telling you, the people that are writing the headlines, the stand firsts, and the body copy in your newspaper and your articles. You have to put yourself into the story with your own set of prejudices, which might be very happy ones. But what is the problem there? We can't take the people out of the news. We can't take the people out of the people that write the news. Is there a problem there? How transparent can you be as a media organisation?
Well, I mean, I actually think that not just The Guardian, but in general, I think we've changed kind of tremendously with the rise of online. And it used to be very much a horizontal model that foreign correspondents would roam around the world, or political reporters, and they would interpret events, and then they would write a story, and that would be presented tablet-like. And now, actually, it is far more of a conversation. It's more of a horizontal thing. You can leave comments. If there's a mistake, you can fix it quite quickly, and people will point it out very often on social media. The Guardian is global. We have most of our readers not in the UK, but all over the place. And we have kind of...
Is its international nature a sign of its... does that take away some of the editorialising? Because you can't editorialise. You can editorialise to a viewpoint, but not to a nation.
I think I'd sort of like to think that there's. C.P. Scott, who was the legendary founder of The Guardian, said facts are sacred, but comment is free. In other words, you need to get the facts right, and then you can have a plural conversation about it. But what I'm trying to say is that it's no longer top down. It's much more engaged with a huge international readership, which is all for the good, And my joke about giving us money, actually people do give us money, and the idea is that everybody should read it. There should be no paywall, no barrier, and so on. So I think that's quite a good and inspirational model. The problem is that you can have malicious nation-state actors, not just the Russians, but they're particularly good at it, who try and subvert that conversation and astroturf with fake commentary written by not real people who troll me every day and try and discredit and subvert the conversation. So it's quite finely balanced, but I think I'm more optimistic than pessimistic, despite the haircut and despite the growing nature of fake news at the moment.
I wonder who has democratised knowledge well. I mean, Sandra, I want to come back to you before we finish. God, that went quickly. I wonder if you have a couple, and maybe we can all think about this, just quick, a couple of examples of who's done it well, because I think actually our audience as well would like to maybe write these names down of people, organisations, instances where it's been done well, detoxifying museums, but democratising knowledge.
I think online I've seen a couple of good examples. There's one called Red Pepper. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that one. I think they do a really good job of putting content out there, but doing it in a way that seems to me to be quite, and unfiltered way. And to a degree, I suppose everything out there that's put out there has a filter to a degree, so we can't really get away from that. But I think they're one example. On another level, in terms of an organisation that's doing something very real and looking at archival sources, there's an organisation that I know very well. They're called Decolonising the Archive. Led by somebody called Etienne Joseph and Connie Bell. I think they do a really fine job of taking some of the difficult histories and really kind of unpacking that, but again, making it in a way that's really accessible around archives and doing it in new, creative, imaginative ways that just bring new people into the conversation. Yeah, and there's lots more I can think of, but I want to give props to those two. Yeah.
Madani.
It'd be remiss of me not to say the name John Passmore Edwards, seeing as we are here at the British Library, a really important philanthropist, someone whose very premise was to democratise knowledge, and so would invest in libraries across our city. I mean, some of the ideas behind Passmore Edwards' position on democratising knowledge across our city spoke to a city, in my opinion, not very different to the one that we're living in today. So revisiting some of these older ideas that I think we forgot to our detriment, actually, can make a contentious point.
Please.
Yeah. It's really interesting about knowledge, isn't it? Like how we consume knowledge. And this isn't me having a particular dig at this organisation, but rather just using it as an example, is when was the last time anyone in this room disagreed with a TED Talk?
Ooh, I don't know.
Interesting.
But the point being here is that I kind of feel like we live in an age where the kind of radical ideas that are being presented to some degree are kind of they're not, they're sort of, the edges of them have been kind of smoothed over. We're trying to aim for ideas that feel very populist, ideas that everyone can access, so everyone feels like they're on the inside of it, so we don't offend, we don't really talk about change. We're talking about you feel good, we feel good, no one leaves this conversation feeling too awkward about themselves. And I think that's something I'm really mindful of, is like...
So that's an echo chamber thing, and that's
absolutely.
something that...
But it's also a way of being that I just think we should be more mindful of kind of going, what are those sources that we're willing to invest in that we think are provoking our thinking? So yeah, 2 examples.
Okay, well, let's talk about that before Luke and Sunetra then, because I think
Sure.
the idea of the echo chamber is something that I'd written down a note for. It's perhaps similar to what Luke was saying, but where lots of people all agree with the same viewpoint, everything becomes very siloed, and it becomes...
I work in culture. I mean, it's a very virtuous field. I mean,
Yeah.
like, we are very virtuous. I mean, by no means do we ever believe we are on the wrong side of the argument. I mean, and this is essentially our Achilles heel, is that we think and look, I think we should believe that actually we're taking a position. But I think it's a misnomer when we say often we're all in this together is a kind of a mantra that's kind of spun out there. I just don't quite believe we're all in this together. I don't believe we're all in this together. So the problem of the echo chamber is it wants consensus around ideas that are the least threatening, depoliticized ideas that are available. And that is problematic with the echo chamber.
Is it desirable to... It's probably a human instinct to want to be in it all together. Is it desirable to want to be in it all together?
I'm not sure when we say who all is in that definition, whether we're being explicit with ourselves about what we mean by all and who we are talking to. So I think we'd be more honest about who all is. That would be a great starting point.
But as a cultural centre, it's good to rub people up
Can I?
the wrong way slightly.
I don't think it's...
Well,
yeah.
I just want to come in because I so wholeheartedly agree with you, and I think consensus has been very detrimental in academia, the sort of endorsement of consensus and cartels. And I think it's actually, the equation is the opposite. I think communitarianism is what goes against consensus. I think consensus arises from individualism because that leads to the form, let's have these agreements between us. Let's have cartels. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. So I actually think the way forward is actually to revive communitarianism.
Totally agree.
And the answer to the question you were asking them for me, who did this well, is the welfare state. Mm-hmm. What happened? I mean,
But I love that
the
idea.
welfare state is what was able to disseminate knowledge, I think, very well, and act against the poison of consensus. And that seems to me to be a big problem.
I love that idea of the idea of losing control and believing in our communities more than we do at present. So kind of to avoid this Christopher Columbus effect of knowledge being given, that somehow it feels much more reciprocal. How do we lose control is, I think, for me, the most important question. For cultural institutions, in terms of knowledge, the idea it becomes a two-way conversation. I feel for too long, culture, academia, our way of being has often been about trying to do unto others, to try and give a position. I feel it's been very one-sided as a position. So in a city like London, the exciting bits of our city emerge from our communities. It's not top-down. It's not policy that creates the London that we love. It comes from our communities. I mean, the academic Mr. Gilroy absolutely speaks to this in his work. I think we shouldn't forget the idea that it emerges in those spaces. It's not policy down. I think it's really important we hold on to that idea.
Sunetra, also, I wanted to ask you about whether you think universities such as yours want to share their knowledge.
Oh,
they kind of want to
absolutely.
with the people that they want to share it with. Is it? Do you think they want to, and is it easy for them to?
I think that the whole idea of a university was about sharing knowledge and creating knowledge through sharing knowledge. So I think, yes, I think those members of the university who still subscribe to what universities are actually for, would definitely want to share knowledge. What's unfortunately happened, of course, is this sort of incursion of individualism and seeing the sort of market-driven models for university education to be enacted within, which of course go entirely against that principle. But so the problem really is this sort of movement that we've had away from what universities are really for, towards the commoditization of knowledge. That's just been lethal.
And that's a whole other massive hour. Well, I say that's
Yes,
another
that's a
whole
whole
thing.
other-
The
don't even get me
commodification.
started.
Don't even get me started.
Can I tell my Trump hair joke, though?
Yes, please.
Well, you go on.
My favourite
theme.
placard is a picture of Trump with "We shall overcome."
She's here all day, ladies and gentlemen. No, she's not. And did you have an example of sort of some of the democratizing of knowledge that you've seen done successfully?
Well, that's what I was saying with the
Yeah.
welfare state. I think
Okay.
that that's how you democratize knowledge, is by creating opportunities for people, young people particularly, to be exposed to types of knowledge which are supposedly privileged but are actually completely accessible. They require some effort, but what needs to be imparted is this idea that that effort is really worthwhile and extremely rewarding. And that can only be, the only mechanism to do that is through a welfare state.
Luke, you've mentioned Russia Today, everyone's favourite propaganda channel. Does Press TV still exist? Anyway, what on the other side of the coin? What are some of the examples of democratising knowledge that you've seen done well?
I think the most impressive guys at the moment are Bellingcat. These are these open source investigators, and what's so good about them is that you can do it from anywhere. You don't have to be a member of the elite. You just need an internet connection. And what they've done, they've broken the most important stories of the last few years by using geolocation, by using all of these kind of tools, social media, user-generated content, videos from war zones, from Syria, from Libya, and so on. And this can be good journalism. It can be used in a court of law if it's human rights abuses in places like Cameroon and so on. I think they're an amazing bunch of citizen investigators, and they're volunteers. Most of them, they're international. They successfully identified the real names of the two Russian military colonels who poisoned Sergei Skripal in Salisbury last year to the great embarrassment of the state. But they're not political. They have done investigations into the far right in the States, so that they're kind of basically they're very good at uncovering lies by individuals or by governments and so on. Yeah, they're really, really impressive, and I think they're the most exciting thing going at the moment in my industry.
We need a bat signal. Just wave it up into the sky.
Actually, the interesting thing is they're more efficient than they're accused all the time of being spies and MI6 and so on, but they're actually far more efficient than any intelligence agency. Right. And also, they're not secret. They publish their method, so anyone can follow it. And that's the beauty, is they have good method, they're completely open, and they're collaborative.
Well, so that's been us talking for 45 minutes or so. Does anyone in the audience have a question for any of our panelists on democratising knowledge? Lady here. We'll bring a microphone around to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Poppy. I work at Arts Catalyst and for lots of different visual arts organisations in London. Thank you, that was a really interesting discussion. And I guess my question is quite radical or political, but it builds on Sunetra's point about the welfare state and the fact that, well, I've just been thinking for a while now, do we not think that the best way to democratise knowledge might be to move away from public schools completely and see real educational reform in which everyone has to lift each other up and all schools are run by the state, so that the knowledge is shared from a young age and that understanding is built from a young age, and that the people who rise to the top are people who come from a sort of worldly perspective and are there based on merit and not because they're part of a club that other people can't be members of.
Is that a question for Sunetra?
It's for everyone, but touching on what Sunetra said, and based on the fact that every day in the news we're reading about how all of the top jobs are taken by people from public education system, and also based on the fact that we see those people making grave errors.
Do you want me to
Do you
answer?
want to take it, Sunetra?
Well, I think, yes, of course, in an ideal situation, you would have a completely state-run system. I sent both my daughters to private schools, though, but because I think at the moment we don't have that kind of a system in place. But I think while these inequalities, well, I would like to say while they get sorted out, but of course we're moving in the opposite direction, it seems. What is necessary is significant investment in exposing children from less privileged backgrounds to what they can actually, what they are capable of. So at the very, that's the least we can do at the moment. But of course we should be heading towards and you know, we were there, we've moved away from that.
Does anyone else want to take one more question? Bring the microphone over to you. Thank you.
My name is Rupa. I'm an ethical blogger, and I have
Sorry,
written
an ethical
blogger.
Uh-huh.
I'm part of the Ethical Influencers Network in the UK. I've written extensively about arts, culture, and social inequality. And even though you have mentioned accessibility, breaking down barriers, expanding knowledge, and make the whole process democratic, I would like to know what is actually being done to change the mindset of people who can benefit from having arts, culture, and knowledge more accessible to them. Because some people still believe that they don't belong there. This could be BMA communities, the working classes, refugees, people who are often marginalized and pushed to the margins of society. That's one point. The other point is that even though some institutions might have nice, good-looking policies on paper, this has to come across as genuine, straight from the heart. And the way the status quo is that some people are made to feel uncomfortable in certain places. They can be made to feel like you don't belong here because you don't look like us, you don't sound like us. And also, socioeconomic is an element that's not protected by law. Mm-hmm. There is law to protect gender, ethnicity, disability, transsexual people, you name it. But socioeconomics is not protected by law, and you can check that. So working class people can be perfectly discriminated in certain places without protection of the law. even the way staff are trained at some institutions has to be reviewed, because some individuals can be treated in a cold, hostile, unwelcome way. So there's no point in creating accessibility if people are not made to feel respected, valued, and welcomed. This is the main point. It's a process that involves everybody, including society. I have been to cultural centers in London. I don't know how many people frequent those places, but almost every European nation is represented in London. And when I go there, I'm most certainly one of the very few people who are ethnic present. It shouldn't be happening. This is London, it's multicultural, it's international, but in practical terms, it doesn't happen. This is in arts, culture, and knowledge. And it's very sad that in 21st century, this is happening, and it's real.
I would say, thank you for your point. And I would say that Sandra, this is presumably, this is precisely why you do what Detox Museums
thank
does.
you for your, just raising that. I mean, I have to say, there's lots, and I know it might sound like a cliche, but there's been some huge, significant changes across culture and arts. I mean, you have people in institutions that are doing dedicated work who've been working for decades to try and change things around. I can think of, there are so many people from Museum Detox, I could just say, come here and to talk as well. I can think of somebody that immediately springs to mind, and I think this was back on your talk, as she came, is Miranda Lowe. Miranda Lowe, a senior curator who's been at the Natural History Museum for over, 27 years. Patrick Campbell, 32 years. I mean, Janet Brown, I can think of at the V&A Museum, who leads the brilliant she's now a senior producer, but she works across African and Caribbean audiences specifically, has been at the V&A Museum for over 13 years. So I think in some ways to say, actually, well, and it can be an easy one to think there isn't enough being done. There is work that's being done. It's not easy. It's not an easy terrain to navigate through. But there are people who are now in positions, I believe, that can genuinely make a difference, who are changing that, who are looking at things right from board level, from trustee level. There are initiatives to get people at that very top of the line, if you like, to make those decisions that can influence programming, that can influence, the visitors who you see when you come in through the door. So there are people in institutions, again, that are doing good work. And you probably might want to say, because there's some brilliant work going over across, like the South Bank Centre as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Come on a Museum Detox. We'll get you out into some institutions and then we'll make you feel welcome.
I think to Sandra's point, we should...
Yeah.
I think to Sandra's point, we should accept there is a lot happening. No one in this room should we shouldn't be beating ourselves up that much. I feel people are asking that question. It is live. I think it's been more alive today than it's probably been in the last kind of 3-4 decades, in my opinion. But look, the point you make is a very real one. How are publicly funded buildings publicly accountable? And I feel that question still remains. I mean, at the moment, that relationship, that framework doesn't exist in a meaningful way. So we have a lot of institutions that are in communities that look nothing like the people that work in those institutions. I mean, the idea of a cultural apartheid could be said to be real in parts of our country, that communities don't look like the buildings that are in those communities. I suppose the other note is there is a moment of disruption, isn't there? Like how much longer will people just accept that public buildings can't be publicly held accountable? And I suppose my view is civil disobedience is a complement to any successful democracy. And people should exercise that right, or otherwise you will be given the version of culture that you are told you require. And unless we're willing to kind of disrupt that framework, yeah, we're playing around the edges.
Well, I'm sorry, we've slightly played around the edges of democratising knowledge, but only partially. There's 100 things that flow from our discussion. Thank you to Madani, to Sandra, to Luke, and to Sunetra. I've been very lucky to share the stage with them. Thank you for your questions and for thinking about it. And I hope you have a wonderful day here in the heart of the Knowledge Quarter. Thank you very much.
So lovely to meet you, man.
Thank you.